You know this person. Something happens. A breakup, a market crash, an election result, a company collapsing, and within days they're telling you with total conviction that they saw it coming, not vaguely, specifically. I always said he wasn't right for her. I knew that stock was overpriced. Maybe you've been that person yourself in a meeting after a project went wrong. They're not lying to you. They believe it completely. And that's what makes it worth understanding, because the same thing is quietly happening inside your own memory right now about things you predicted years ago. Psychologists call this hindsight bias, and the classic demonstration of it involves something surprisingly mundane: 2 foreign trips taken by an American president. In 1975, researchers Baruch Fischhoff and Ruth Beyth asked people to estimate, before it happened, how likely a series of outcomes were from Richard Nixon's upcoming trips to China and the Soviet Union. Would he meet with Chairman Mao? Would the 2 countries agree to a joint space program? People gave their honest odds in advance on paper. Then, after the trips were over and the actual outcomes were known, the researchers went back to the same people and asked them to recall what odds they had originally given. Almost nobody remembered correctly. If an event had actually happened, people now recalled having thought it was more likely than they'd actually said. If it hadn't happened, they recalled having thought it was less likely. Their memory hadn't just faded, it had been quietly rewritten to match the outcome, and they had no idea it had happened. Fischhoff had another name for the same effect: creeping determinism. Once you know how something turned out, your mind reorganizes the past to make that outcome feel inevitable. Not through anything you'd notice as lying. It happens underneath conscious control in the same process that lets you remember anything at all. Here's the part worth trusting. This isn't one of those 70s findings that quietly fell apart later. Hindsight bias has been retested well over 100 times since, in courtrooms, hospitals, trading floors, and classrooms, and it keeps showing up. It's one of the more durable results in the whole field. The stakes of that get real fast. In one study, physicians were given an actual patient case and asked how likely each of several possible diagnoses was. Other physicians were given the same case, told which diagnosis turned out to be correct, and asked to estimate what they would have guessed without that knowledge. The second group consistently overestimated how obvious the right answer had been. People trained for years to reason carefully about uncertainty still could not fully separate what they now knew from what they would have known beforehand, and it connects to something bigger than remembering a single prediction. Memory itself isn't a recording, it's a reconstruction, rebuilt slightly differently every time you access it, using whatever you currently know to fill in the gaps. The clearest demonstration of that came from a very different kind of memory. The morning after the Challenger space shuttle disaster in 1986, researchers had over 100 college students write down in detail exactly how they'd heard the news, where they were, who told them, what they were doing. 2.5 years later, the researchers found several dozen of those original students and asked them again. The second accounts were often confident, detailed, and specific. They were also, in a striking number of cases, simply wrong. About 1 in 4 students described a completely different scene the second time. A different room, a different person telling them, sometimes a different day, and had no idea their story had changed. Their confidence in the false version was just as high as their confidence in the version they had written the morning after. Confidence and accuracy had come apart completely. Put those 2 findings together and you get a genuinely uncomfortable picture. The version of your past self that you carry around, the one who always knew, the one who had a feeling, is not a preserved copy. It's a draft your mind keeps quietly editing, using today's information without asking your permission. Which is why hindsight bias is so much more than a minor memory quirk. It breaks the one mechanism you actually have for getting better at judgment, comparing your prediction to what happened. If you can't accurately remember what you thought was going to happen, you can never honestly check how good your thinking actually was. Every wrong call quietly gets reclassified in your own head as something you basically saw coming. Every mistake gets absorbed instead of examined. You end up feeling more accurate with each passing year without ever actually becoming more accurate, because the feedback loop you would need to improve has been silently switched off. There is one practice that reliably interrupts this, and it isn't complicated. Before you know the outcome, you write your prediction down. A date, a clear claim in your own words, and this part matters, one honest reason you might be wrong. Not a vague impression, something specific enough that you cannot quietly edit it later. This is not a guess. Researchers studying professional forecasters found that the people who consistently predicted world events most accurately, the ones who came to be called superforecasters, treated a dated written record as non-negotiable, not because they trusted their own memory less than everyone else does, because they understood that nobody's memory can be trusted here, including their own, and a written record is the only thing immune to being rewritten by the outcome. That reason you might be wrong is not a separate step tacked onto the end. It is what makes the whole practice work. This is the part debiasing researchers keep coming back to. Name the alternative outcome before you know the real one. Do that, and it becomes much harder for your mind to later insist the actual result was the only one you ever considered. None of this is about becoming less confident. It's about making your confidence answerable to something outside your own head. The next time you catch yourself saying, "I knew it," it's worth checking whether you actually wrote that down anywhere before you knew it. Most of the time, you will find that you didn't. And that gap between what you remember believing and what you actually believed is exactly where hindsight bias lives. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this video gave you something to think about, do one small thing. Subscribe to Coolmymind Psychology. Every video here unpacks the hidden psychology behind how we think, feel, and act, and subscribing is how you'll never miss the next one. Take care of your mind, and I will see you in the next video.